there they made the Door of Night, Mori Tarnon, or Tarnfu as the Eldar name it in their tongues. There it still stands, utterly black and huge against the deep blue walls. Its pillars are of the mightiest basalt, and its lintel likewise, but great dragons of black stone are carved thereon, and shadowy smoke pours slowly from their jaws. John Howe is arguably one of the most famous illustrators and artists associated with the works of J.R.R. Tolkien. In one of his famous pieces, titled The Door of Night, Howe depicts the door, carved with great black dragon statues, as the ship of Erendil, called Vingolot, passes through the door into what Tolkien describes as the oceans of heaven. My archive series takes a look at how Tolkien developed the Legendarium over the years, and in this video I want to discuss this image, the history of the Door of Night itself, and how the artist must have taken inspiration from a very early version of Tolkien's writings, perhaps making it an accurate piece of artwork from a very old passage, maybe incompatible with Tolkien's later versions, but as I will explain, this shouldn't really matter. Before getting into details about dragon statues, what exactly is the Door of Night? Even this question has different answers depending on the dates of Tolkien's text. Most will be aware of the Door of Night from Christopher Tolkien's edited Silmarillion, even if it exists almost in name only, with no in-depth explanation provided. In fact, the Silmarillion only mentions the Door of Night twice, in a chapter Christopher Tolkien clearly struggled with, in order to provide a complete narrative. The final chapter in the Quenta Silmarillion, of the voyage of Erendil and the War of Wrath. In this short chapter, we are told about Erendil's journey to the Blessed Realm, his plea with the Valar for assistance in saving the lands east of the Blessed Realm, the coming of the host of the Valar in the 4 decades-long War of Wrath, and Morgoth's defeat. It is a chapter I believe rushes to a conclusion. But they took Vingolot and hallowed it, and bore it away through Valinor to the uttermost rim of the world, and there it passed through the Door of Night, and was lifted up even into the oceans of heaven. But Morgoth himself the Valar thrust through the Door of Night, beyond the walls of the world, into the timeless void, and a guard is set forever on those walls, and Erendil keeps watch upon the ramparts of the sky. By only reading the Silmarillion, it's difficult to work out what this door is. For an explanation, we have Tolkien's original idea for the door, found in the Book of Lost Tales. While this text is outdated, and was severely changed in later text, which I will cover, it is still the only text speaking of dragons alongside the Door of Night. In this early text, we are told that the Door of Night has gates unbreakable, and that none know how they were made or set, because elves were not suffered to be in that dread building. The Door of Night is the last secret of the gods, meaning the Valar. Its gates only open to a mystic word, known by at least the king of the Valar, Manwë, who shared it with the figure Urwendi, the original name for the Maya Silmarillion readers know as Arian, the guide of the sun. This was when Tolkien imagined the Door of Night as a gateway, allowing the passage of the sun itself, guided by Urwendi. The sun would pass through it and return into the world through the gates of morning in the east. What's interesting about this version is that beyond the Door of Night lies the outer dark, which fits with later versions. But here, Tolkien says the Door of Night acts as some escape from the world and death itself. allowing the hearing of things not yet meant for those dwelling on earth. That word Aerwynna only knows, and Manwe who spake it to her, for beyond the door of night is the outer dark, and he who passes therethrough may escape the world and death, and hear things not yet for the ears of earth dwellers, and this may not be. As this is the first version of Tolkien's narrative, these ideas are dated between 1916 and 1920, and in what Christopher Tolkien described as the next phase of Tolkien's cosmology, we can find a very different version of the Door of Night, dated from the 1930s. Here, the Door of Night is explained with less of a mythological and unknowable feel, less mysterious. It is the only gate separating the physical world from the outer dark. The walls surrounding Arda, known as the Walls of the World, are the unbroken shell of a globe, impassable anywhere except the Door of Night. Instead of its origins being unknown and perhaps ancient, it is outright stated that the Valar themselves made the door for the purpose of expelling Melkor from Arda following his defeat. Melkor, known as Melko at this time in Tolkien's writings, was forced from the world into the outer dark through the Door of Night. The Walls of the World, Ilurambar, are the unbroken, uninterrupted shell of a vast globe. They are cold, invisible, and impassable, save by Andu Loman, the Door of Night. This door was made by the Valar when Melko was overcome and put forth into the outer dark, and Arendil guards it. This was quite a shift, showing this next phase as Christopher Tolkien called it. The Door of Night, moving away from a mysterious gateway allowing the passage of the sun, only being opened through a mystic word, holding secrets and mysteries related to death and knowledge not meant for earth dwellers, becoming a door to banish a Dark Lord, the one gateway between the physical world and the outer dark. The sun no longer passing through a gate, but passing below the earth. The early version fitting in with Tolkien's original motives for creating his Legendarium, mythological in influence, mysterious, existing as some ancient structure beyond the knowledge of the lore masters sharing their tales with us. If we return to the mysterious black dragon statues depicted in John Howe's art, only one passage mentions these dragons, the first version of the story I have outlined. And without getting into needless debates about the so-called canon, it is not an opinion to say that the Book of Lost Tales is a study of origins and beginnings, the first phase, the early stages of Tolkien's imagined secondary world. Much of the text from this era was altered in many ways, sometimes dramatically so. Does anyone out there remember the Dark Lord Sauron as a fae or sprite called Thu, or the Prince of Cats, Tevildo? Text that wasn't altered directly was sometimes purposefully abandoned, or just never mentioned again. Dragons existing on the Door of Night only really becomes an issue if we stick to old text. As said, the door in early writings was made to allow the passing of the sun, at a time when dragons may not have even existed as creatures. Glaurung, the father of dragons in the Silmarillion, is the first of the Uruk-loki, the fire drakes of the north. This dragon issued forth from Angban's gates 260 years into the First Age, though we don't know exactly when he was made. The First Age began with the rising of the moon, followed by the sun, meaning dragons could have existed on the Door of Night before they existed within the world itself. But again, this is only a problem if we mix early versions of the cosmology with later versions, mixing the first phase with the second phase, or even the third phase of development. If you choose to believe that the dragons still existed on the Door of Night when Tolkien changed the origin and purpose of the door, then we'd be left to ponder the reasons why the Valar would decorate this door with symbols of Morgoth, creatures he may have corrupted from existing life, corrupted monsters of a Dark Lord. What would be the reason? Would it be symbolic, a sign related to the one banished beyond the door, or a warning to all about the Dark Lord beyond? One idea that is perhaps difficult to align with all these different timeline issues is that the dragons on the Door of Night could exist as representations of guardians, warnings not to pass, just like we have regional variations of gargoyles, viewed as guardians or protectors. What if Morgoth himself was influenced by these statues, to the point where even they were corrupted in some way when he made his plans on Earth, influencing him from his time outside the world? This doesn't really work unless we really mix up the timeline, but I thought this was an interesting idea that was shared. For me, I imagine these dragons as being a feature of early mythologically influenced text, maybe based on the role of dragons, reptiles and serpents in various myths and religious traditions, written at a time when Tolkien heavily drew influence from established traditions. Their role as treacherous creatures, an evil omen or warning on this Door of Night, commanding others not to pass, somewhat similar to the two watchers guarding the gateway of the Tower of Cirith Ungol in The Lord of the Rings. All of this being at a time when Tolkien had not yet developed dragons as very real creatures that served Morgoth in his realm. Rather than try to force early versions into later versions, there's nothing wrong with disregarding this text, or keeping it if you choose. If you want to imagine the Valar carving these creatures of Morgoth outside the world in the place he would now be imprisoned, then why not? If you want to imagine dragons as some embellishment of what the Door of Night looks like when being described by lore masters and storytellers who would never have the chance to see it with their own eyes, again, why not? Tolkien focused more on the changing role of the Door of Night as he developed his mythology, once being a gateway of the sun, to a door used to banish the first Dark Lord. What it looked like must have been inconsequential, otherwise Tolkien would have carried forward such descriptive text, or offered another description. Whether it was carved with the likeness of dragons, other beasts, or nothing at all is a mystery. The fact that the only mention of dragons comes from such an early text leaves it all to our imagination. What could such a structure look like? Was it really there as a physical object? Or is it how our minds would perceive such a gateway between creation and the outside? John Howe imagined the Great Door as surrounded by terrible black dragons, influenced by the early imagination of Tolkien. The question is, how do you picture the Door of Night?